It was meant to be an unforgettable vacation in a quiet, picturesque Italian town, an escape from the hustle and bustle of life. But what was supposed to be a dream trip soon became an unimaginable nightmare. The sun was beginning to set over the hills of Tuscany, casting a golden light on the village's cobbled streets. The streets of the small town were empty, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Sarah stood on the edge of the town square, gazing at the faded terracotta buildings. She tried to take in the beauty of the place, but there was a knot in her stomach that wouldn't loosen. Something felt off. She reached out to adjust the strap of her handbag, trying to focus on the surroundings instead of the unease creeping up her spine. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at her. She turned her gaze back toward her husband, Mark, and his childhood friends who were all gathered in the middle of the square, laughing and joking like they always did. Mark had always been a planner, the kind of man who enjoyed organizing adventures. He had surprised her with this trip to celebrate their 10-year anniversary, and she had to admit it was a sweet gesture. Tuscany had always been on their bucket list. The wine, the food, the beautiful rolling hills. It seemed like the perfect place to reconnect. And yet, there was something beneath the surface that made her feel uneasy. The friends had arrived with high spirits, eager to escape their busy lives and spend some time together. Ben, Jack, and Tom had been part of Mark's circle since high school. They had always been close, always joking around, pulling pranks, and getting into mischief. Sarah had grown used to their antics over the years. But this trip felt different. There was something about the way they were behaving that unsettled her. She shifted her attention back to the group. Mark was laughing with Ben, clapping him on the back as if they had just shared a hilarious inside joke. But Sarah didn't find it funny. She could feel it deep in her gut, the tension that seemed to hover in the air, a heaviness that threatened to choke the life out of the evening. It was supposed to be a carefree trip, yet Sarah couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had taken root. The group decided to explore the town a little more. The streets twisted and turned like a maze, leading them further into the heart of the village. The buildings here were small but full of character, old stone houses covered in ivy, narrow alleys with overflowing flower boxes, and windows that seemed to peer out like the eyes of some forgotten soul. Sarah walked quietly, keeping pace with the others, but the tightness in her chest grew with every step. Ben had wandered ahead, and when he returned, Sarah noticed something odd. There was an unsettling look in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't malicious, but there was an almost mischievous glint. Like he was in on something she didn't understand. His eyes were a little too wide, his smile a little too forced. "Here you go, guys," Ben said, holding up a bottle of wine he had bought from a small corner shop. "Picked up something local to celebrate." The store owner was a bit weird, but whatever. "It's authentic." Mark grinned, taking the bottle from him. "You know, Ben, you always manage to find the strangest people." Ben laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "I just thought it was funny that he insisted on giving me a bottle wrapped in this old cloth. You know, like one of those superstitious things." Sarah wasn't sure why, but the mention of superstitions made her skin prickle. Maybe it was just the wine, or maybe it was the way Ben had said it, as if he were trying to make it sound casual, but there was something about it that didn't sit well with her. She tried to push it out of her mind. It was probably just the unfamiliar environment, the unfamiliar language, and the unfamiliar faces. She had to relax. But the unease lingered. Tom, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly spoke up. "Let's head toward the town square," he suggested. "I saw a really cool spot where we can get a good view of the valley. It'll be perfect for a group photo." The others agreed enthusiastically. The night was still young, and the air was warm with the smell of earth and olives. Sarah, trying to push away her growing discomfort, followed along. The group made their way through narrow alleyways, weaving between the towering buildings. As they turned a corner, Sarah caught sight of something that made her pause, a narrow street that seemed to lead away from the town, towards an area where the buildings grew sparse, and the ground was overtaken by thick, wild grass. It seemed almost out of place, as if it didn't belong in this quiet town. "Everything okay?" Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. He looked at her with a concerned frown, but when she didn't respond, he gave her a reassuring smile. "You're just tired. We all are. It's been a long day. Let's just head to the square and enjoy the view." Sarah smiled weakly, forcing the unease down. Maybe she was just overthinking it. After all, this was just a vacation, a time to relax. The group continued on, with Mark and the others chatting and laughing, but Sarah's mind wandered. The further they went, the quieter it became. The laughter from the group seemed to echo off the walls of the streets, but it didn't feel like they were laughing together. It felt distant. As they reached the town square, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. A strange tension hung in the air. The square was empty except for a small group of people standing near the fountain, their faces obscured by shadows. Sarah didn't like the way they were looking at them, their eyes fixed in their direction, as if they knew something they didn't. "Let's go this way," Ben said, motioning toward a narrow side street that veered off the square. "There's a wine bar I've been wanting to check out." Before Sarah could protest, Mark nodded in agreement. "It's okay. We'll be fine. Just a small detour, and then we can call it a night." Sarah hesitated, but once again, she swallowed her growing concerns. What could be the harm? It was just a bar, just a little detour. But as they walked closer to the side street, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate. They were tall, their faces obscured by the darkness, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her. She instinctively grabbed Mark's arm, but he didn't notice. He was too busy chatting with Jack. Tom had already walked ahead, his attention focused on something else. "Sarah?" Mark turned to look at her when she didn't speak. The two figures were getting closer. She could feel their eyes boring into her, and something deep inside her knew this wasn't just a coincidence. "Mark, we need to leave," she said, her voice shaky. Mark stopped in his tracks, glancing at her with a furrowed brow. "What's wrong? You're acting like..." Before he could finish, one of the figures stepped forward. It was a man, his face partially illuminated by the dim light from the street lamp overhead. "Pardon me, Signora," he said in heavily accented English, his voice smooth but cold. "Are you lost?" Sarah froze. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. The man's eyes were dark, almost too dark, and they felt like they were searching into her very soul. "Just a misunderstanding," the man continued, stepping even closer. "Nothing to worry about." But Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a chance encounter. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of terror that left her breathless. "Mark, we need to go. Now," she whispered urgently. But before Mark could respond, the second figure moved closer. The street seemed to narrow, and the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. Sarah could feel her heart racing, her palms sweating as she tried to push through the overwhelming fear that gripped her. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, Mark's face went pale, and his voice cracked. "Sarah, we're in trouble." Before she could even process what he said, the figures stepped aside, revealing something that made her stomach turn. Two more men, standing in the shadows, their faces hidden, their postures rigid. There was no escape. The prank had taken a dark turn, and they were in far more danger than they had ever realized. The cold grip of fear squeezed Sarah's chest as she stood frozen in the middle of the street. The man's eyes were dark and unblinking, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud waiting to burst. It wasn't just that they were being watched, it was the cold, calculating way in which the strangers moved and acted, as though they were part of something bigger, something far more dangerous than Sarah could even comprehend. Mark's voice cracked, pulling Sarah back to reality. "We need to go. Now." The words felt hollow in the thick, tense air. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The other men, who had stepped into the shadows moments earlier, were now emerging again, their eyes never leaving the group. The street seemed to narrow with every passing second, the alleyway drawing them in like a trap they couldn't escape. "Mark, what is going on?" Sarah whispered, clutching his arm tightly. Mark's face was pale, his jaw clenched. He was a man of confidence, the kind who knew how to handle most situations, but there was an unfamiliar vulnerability in his eyes now, a fear that matched Sarah's own. He had been the one to plan this trip, he had been the one to assure her everything would be fine, but now, with the shadows closing in, he seemed just as lost as she was. We need to get out of here," he muttered, but it was too late. The figures were too close now. There was no easy way out. The man who had spoken earlier, the one with the cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward again. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate and slow. "You found our town, Signora," he said, his accent thick but clear. "And now, you must understand the rules." Sarah's stomach turned. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The way he spoke, so calm and measured, was the most terrifying thing of all. There was no panic, no urgency. This man wasn't in a hurry. And that, more than anything, made her blood run cold. "Rules?" Mark repeated, his voice sounding smaller than usual. "Yes," the man replied, his lips curling into a thin smile. "The rules of the game. You see, your friends here," he glanced briefly at Ben, Jack, and Tom, who had stood in stunned silence the entire time, "are very familiar with them." Sarah's eyes darted from one face to the next. Ben, Jack, and Tom looked as shocked as she felt, but there was something else in their eyes, a flicker of recognition, a flash of realization. Sarah had known these men for years, but now, she felt like she didn't know them at all. They weren't reacting the way she would have expected them to. They weren't panicking. They weren't even speaking. "Mark," she whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve. "What's going on? What's happening?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back, his face still pale. The cold air seemed to tighten around them, and Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Something was terribly wrong, and it had started with the prank that was supposed to be harmless, the prank that had now spiraled into something far more sinister. The man in front of them raised a hand. And instantly, the other figures stepped forward, flanking them like silent sentinels. They were surrounded. "Please, just tell us what you want," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. But it was no use. Fear was creeping into her words, giving away the vulnerability she was trying so hard to mask. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply stepped aside, his gaze shifting toward the two men standing behind him. One of them was older, with graying hair and a stern expression. The other was younger, but his cold eyes were just as unsettling as the rest. The older man nodded once, and Sarah felt an icy chill creep up her spine. "Your husband and his friends," the older man began in a voice that was both deep and steady, "came to our town with a very specific purpose." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What purpose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The older man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile full of dark knowledge. "A game, Signora. A very dangerous game." Sarah looked at Mark, but he avoided her gaze. She could see the guilt in his eyes now, the shame that he couldn't hide. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Why is this happening?" The younger man, the one with the cold eyes, leaned in slightly. Because we don't play by the rules you're used to, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And because your husband and his friends wanted to see what it's like when the stakes are higher than they've ever been before. Sarah felt the floor beneath her shift. She stumbled slightly, but Mark caught her by the arm, steadying her. Mark, what is this? What is going on? Her voice was frantic now, but Mark didn't speak. Instead, he just stood there, his lips pressed together in a grim line. The cold man took a step forward, towering over them all. You see, this town doesn't just play games for fun. We play for survival. Survival? Sarah's mind reeled. What did he mean by that? Your husband and his friends decided to test the boundaries of your friendship, the man continued. They wanted to know what would happen when the walls came down, when trust was pushed to the limit. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was like a slap in the face. She couldn't understand. Was this some kind of sick joke? But the gravity in the air, the silence that pressed down on them, told her otherwise. This wasn't a game. This was something else entirely. Do you know what happens when you're pushed to the edge? The older man asked. What it really takes to survive when everything falls apart. We're about to show you. The town had been beautiful, a place where time seemed to stand still, where the rolling hills and the quaint buildings offered a glimpse of a simpler life. But now, Sarah saw it for what it truly was. A town with a dark, twisted history. A town where people weren't what they seemed. She could feel the walls closing in, the shadows stretching longer. The other men, the ones who had been so silent, so complicit, finally spoke. We didn't know, Ben said quietly, his voice barely audible. We didn't know it was going to be like this. What didn't you know? Sarah asked, her voice rising in desperation. Jack stepped forward, his eyes downcast. This was supposed to be a joke. Just a harmless prank. We didn't know it would escalate like this. But it wasn't a joke anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Sarah's mind was spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of what had happened. What had started as a fun trip with friends, a vacation to celebrate their lives, had turned into a nightmare. And the worst part was that they had walked right into it without even knowing. The man in front of them, the one who had been so calm, so cold, finally spoke again. It's too late to turn back now. You're part of this game, and you'll play by our rules. There's no way out. Mark's eyes flickered with regret, but it was too late. The game had begun, and there was no stopping it. The tension in the air was unbearable. Sarah's chest felt tight as if the very air was pushing down on her. Her mind raced, trying to process the words that had just been spoken, but they didn't make sense. It couldn't be true. This was just a prank. A sick, twisted prank, but a prank all the same. Yet, deep down, she knew that what was happening wasn't just some cruel joke. The way the man had spoken, the look in his eyes, they weren't kidding. Mark, Sarah whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. What is going on? Mark didn't look at her. He couldn't. The weight of the moment was too much for him to bear. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line, as though the words he had to say were too heavy to leave his mouth. Sarah grabbed his arm, turning him to face her. Mark, please. What have you done? What is this? Mark hesitated, his gaze shifting from her to the group of strangers standing before them. His throat tightened, as if he were struggling to find the right words. Finally, his lips parted, but it wasn't an explanation that came out. It was a confession. I didn't know it would go this far, he said, his voice low, almost inaudible. I didn't know what they were capable of. Who are they? Sarah asked, her voice shaking with the weight of her fear. What is this game you've gotten us into? Mark glanced around nervously, as if trying to read the faces of the men surrounding them. He could feel their eyes on him, their unspoken judgment hanging in the air like a thick fog. The older man, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward, cutting off any further attempts at conversation. "You don't need to know who we are, Signora," he said coldly, his voice smooth and steady. "What matters is that you understand the rules. You and your friends are part of something much bigger than you realize now. You have no choice but to play along." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as her mind tried to process what was happening. A game? They had been pulled into some kind of dangerous game that had started with a simple prank. But this wasn't a game. This was real. And it was terrifying. "What do you mean, play along?" Mark finally found his voice again, his words coming out strained. "What are you asking of us?" The older man smiled, a cruel, empty smile that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "You will do as we say. Each of you will face a challenge, one designed to push you to your limits. You will have to make difficult choices, and not everyone will make it through. If you succeed, you'll leave this town with your lives and your freedom. If you fail," he let the words hang in the air, his smile never fading. "Fail?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "What do you mean, fail? What happens if we fail?" The older man's eyes narrowed. "You'll find out soon enough. But remember, this is not just about survival. It's about testing your character. Your loyalty. Your very will to live." "What are you talking about?" Ben finally spoke, his voice hoarse and filled with panic. "This isn't what we signed up for. We just came here to have a good time." The older man raised an eyebrow. "And that was your first mistake. You should have known better. You should have realized that when you play with fire, you get burned." Sarah's breath quickened. The way they spoke, the casual cruelty in their words, made it clear that this wasn't just about a twisted joke. This was something far darker. They had been lured into a trap, a game that they didn't understand, one where the rules were deliberately vague, and the consequences were deadly. "Enough talk," the younger man with the cold eyes said, stepping forward. "The game is about to begin. We'll start with you." He pointed at Tom, who stood frozen, staring at the group of men as if his legs had turned to stone. "No, no way," Tom stammered, shaking his head. "I don't want any part of this. This is insane." The cold-eyed man gave him a chilling smile. "It's too late for that, Tom. You're already part of it. And there's no turning back now." Without another word, the younger man gestured for the group to follow him. They were ushered down the narrow alleyway toward a building at the far end of the square. Sarah could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears as she walked, trying to steady herself. The walls of the alley seemed to close in on them, the air thick with a suffocating sense of doom. As they approached the building, Sarah saw that it was an old, decrepit structure, its windows boarded up and its door hanging loosely on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but as the cold-eyed man opened the door, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. Inside, the air was damp and musty, the floor creaking beneath their feet as they entered. The walls were covered in strange, faded symbols, some of which Sarah couldn't recognize. She had a feeling she didn't want to know what they meant. The room they stepped into was small and dimly lit, with only a few flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Take your seats," the cold-eyed man ordered, motioning toward a row of chairs that had been arranged in front of a large wooden table. The chairs were old and uncomfortable, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. Reluctantly, the group obeyed, sitting down in silence. As Sarah lowered herself into the chair, she noticed a peculiar object in the center of the table. It was a small box, made of dark wood with intricate carvings etched into its surface. The box seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and Sarah's stomach churned at the sight of it. "This is your first challenge," the older man said, his voice taking on a chilling edge. "Inside this box is an item. You will each take turns reaching into the box and pulling out the item that lies within. What you choose will determine your fate." "What do you mean?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. "What do you mean, determine our fate?" The older man's eyes glinted in the dim light. "You'll see soon enough. The box doesn't lie. It reveals your true nature. But be warned, the wrong choice could mean the end for you. Choose wisely." There was a long, unbearable silence. Each member of the group looked at the box, then at each other, their faces pale with fear. Sarah's hands trembled, and her breath came in shallow gasps. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was. Tom was the first to move. His hand reached slowly toward the box, his eyes flicking nervously between the others. Sarah could see the hesitation in his movements, the fear in his eyes. When his hand touched the edge of the box, the room seemed to grow even colder. The others watched in silence, waiting for him to pull something out. Tom's fingers brushed against the surface of the box, and suddenly, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. There was a low hum, and Sarah felt a strange pressure building in her chest. Tom's fingers tightened, and with a quick jerk, he pulled something from the box. It was a small, black stone, smooth and featureless. It gleamed in the dim light, its surface glimmering with an almost hypnotic sheen. "What does it mean?" Tom asked, holding the stone up to the light. The older man leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You'll find out soon enough. But for now, pass it to the next person." The game had begun. The silence in the room was suffocating. Tom's hand trembled as he held the smooth black stone up to the dim light, the flickering of the small candles casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. Sarah could feel the weight of his actions hanging in the air, her own breath shallow with fear. This was no longer a game, no longer a prank gone wrong. This was real, and the stakes had just been raised higher than any of them could have imagined. "What do we do with it?" Tom asked, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. The stone in his hand seemed to pulse, as though it had a life of its own. The older man, who had been the calm, calculating leader of this twisted game, studied the stone carefully, as though he could sense the significance of the object that Tom had drawn. His lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. Only coldness. Only darkness. "Pass it to the next," he said, his tone flat, without emotion. It was clear that he wasn't interested in answers or explanations. "You will each face your own trial. The stone has chosen its bearer." Tom stared at the stone for a long moment, as if waiting for something, some kind of sign that would tell him what to do. But there was nothing. The stone remained silent, still, its smooth surface unmarred by any clue to its meaning. Slowly, hesitantly, Tom passed it to Jack, who was sitting next to him, his face pale and drawn. Jack took the stone, his hand closing around it with an audible tremor. The room felt even colder now, the air thick and suffocating. "I don't understand what's happening," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Sarah glanced at Mark, who was sitting next to her, his face ashen and stricken with guilt. She could feel the weight of his gaze upon her, but it was clear that Mark, like the rest of them, was struggling to make sense of what was unfolding. His lips trembled, but no words came out. He could no longer speak, not with any conviction, not with any confidence. They had been pulled into something far beyond their control. Something terrifying. And no matter how much they tried to rationalize it, there was no escaping the grim truth that this was their reality now. Jack's hand hovered over the stone. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like he might throw it away, as if rejecting the game altogether. But something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of fear, of desperation, and he reached forward, pulling the stone from Tom's hand. The moment his fingers closed around it, a loud, resonating hum filled the room. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the whisper of a breeze stirring the leaves of a tree. But then it grew louder, more intense, vibrating through the very air around them. Jack froze, his fingers tightening around the stone. The hum grew louder, turning into an unbearable ringing sound. Then, without warning, the room darkened, the flickering candles extinguishing in an instant. Sarah gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out instinctively for Mark's hand, squeezing it tightly as if trying to anchor herself in the midst of the chaos. "What is happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. In the pitch-black darkness, Sarah could hear nothing but the sound of her own breath, shallow and quick. Time seemed to stretch out, every second a slow eternity. The tension in the air was palpable, as though someone, was watching them. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, pressing down on her chest until she could hardly breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone dark, the light returned. But it wasn't the same as before. The room was now bathed in a faint, unnatural glow. The walls seemed to shimmer with a strange, ethereal light, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The air smelled different, dank and oppressive, like the inside of a crypt. Jack was no longer sitting in his chair. In his place stood a figure. A figure that hadn't been there moments before. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the person who had replaced Jack. It was a man, but he wasn't Jack. He was tall, with sharp features, his eyes burning with a cold intensity. His clothes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as if they weren't quite solid, as if they existed in another reality entirely. The man's face was impassive, almost emotionless, but there was something about his presence that made Sarah's blood run cold. What happened to Jack?" Ben asked, his voice thick with panic. The older man, who had been standing silently at the back of the room, finally spoke. "Your friend Jack has chosen. He has made his decision." "What decision?" Sarah demanded. She could feel the edge of hysteria creeping into her voice. "Where is he? What did you do to him?" The figure standing where Jack had been before slowly turned to face them, his expression cold and distant. "He has passed the trial," the man said, his voice calm and steady. "He has chosen his path." Sarah's mind reeled. This was impossible. How could Jack have just disappeared? What was this trial, and why had Jack been chosen? "What does that mean?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. He, too, was grasping for answers, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "It means," the man said, "that Jack has proven himself worthy of the next stage. He has made his choice. And now, he is free to leave this place." He gestured to the dark figure that had replaced Jack. "He has ascended." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Ascended? What did that even mean? What kind of twisted place had they been dragged into? "You don't have to understand," the older man continued. "All that matters is that Jack has chosen. He has passed his test. And now, the rest of you will face your own trials. The game has just begun." Sarah felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a test. It was something else entirely, a nightmare that had no end, no resolution. They were trapped, and there was no way out. The figure that had replaced Jack raised his hand, as if to signal the beginning of something even darker. "It is your turn," he said, his voice echoing through the room. Tom stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. He looked from Sarah to Mark to the others, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. "What is going on?" he whispered. "Where is Jack? What did we just see?" "We don't know," Ben replied, his voice hoarse with fear. "None of this makes sense." The figure moved toward Tom, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. "It's your turn now," he said, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "You will choose. And you will face the consequences of that choice." Tom looked terrified, his eyes wide with panic. He had no choice but to step forward. The moment he did, the air around them grew heavier, suffocating. His hand shook as he reached for the box, his fingers hovering above it. The moment his hand touched the lid of the box, a jolt of energy shot through his body, the shock of it almost throwing him to the ground. He gasped, his entire body trembling as if he had just touched something electric, something alive. The room around him seemed to warp, the walls twisting and warping as if they were alive, breathing. "What's happening?" Tom whispered, his voice cracking with fear. The older man spoke again, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "The trials will take you to the edge. Only the strongest will survive. And only the truest will ascend." Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest as she watched Tom struggle against the unseen force. She wanted to reach out, to help him, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear. This was no longer a game. It was a nightmare. And they were trapped in it, unable to escape. The glowing figure that had replaced Jack stepped forward, his presence somehow more menacing than before. "You've all made your choices," he said, his voice dripping with cold authority. "And now, you must face the consequences." The room grew darker once more, the air thick with the sense that something terrible was about to unfold. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out again. Everything went dark. The darkness felt suffocating. Sarah could no longer hear her own breath, the absence of light making the silence deafening. Every part of her body was on edge, every nerve humming with an unnatural tension. The moment the lights had gone out, she had instinctively reached for Mark's hand, but it wasn't there. The coldness of the room was like ice on her skin, and she could feel her heart racing in her chest. Her pulse was deafening in her ears, but the surrounding silence was worse. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath along with her. Then, without warning, a low hum filled the room, the same vibration that had shaken the air when Jack had first touched the stone. Sarah could feel it this time, more intensely, as though it were resonating deep inside her chest. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as if the very walls of the room were vibrating with it. Her thoughts raced, and she struggled to make sense of what was happening. Was this part of the game? Was it the next step? Or was this something far worse, something beyond their control? The question spun in her mind over and over again, but she couldn't find an answer. She had seen what had happened to Jack, and the fear of losing someone else, losing Mark, gripped her heart with icy fingers. "Mark?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she called out into the void. There was no response. "Mark," she repeated louder, panic creeping into her chest. But again, the silence remained. The air shifted, then. The stillness seemed to shudder, like the calm before a storm. And then, just as quickly as the light had vanished, it returned, suddenly and violently. The room was filled with a harsh, blinding white light that seemed to come from every direction, making it impossible to see clearly for a moment. Sarah squinted, her eyes watering as they tried to adjust to the brightness. When her vision cleared, the scene before her was even more horrifying than she had anticipated. They were no longer in the same room. The room had shifted, transformed, into something entirely different. Gone were the wooden walls, the stale air, and the eerie glow. Instead, they were standing in what appeared to be a vast, open space. A wide, barren desert stretched out in every direction, with only the faintest traces of civilization, distant, crumbling buildings on the horizon. The ground beneath them was cracked and dry, and the heat was almost unbearable, making Sarah's skin prickle with discomfort. But the strangest thing of all was the figure standing before them. It was a man, but not one they recognized. His eyes gleamed with a strange, unsettling light, and his movements were almost unnatural, as though he weren't entirely human. His face was covered with a dark mask, one that obscured any trace of emotion. He stood tall, taller than any of them, and as he stepped forward, it felt as though the very earth beneath their feet trembled. "Welcome to the trial of souls," the man's voice boomed, deep and resonant, filling the vast space around them. You have each chosen to partake in the game. Now, you will face the trial that awaits you. There is no turning back. The path ahead will test everything you are, your mind, your spirit, your soul. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A trial? This was what they had been preparing for. But the questions kept coming. What trial? What was he talking about? What was he going to do to them? Each of you will face your own challenge, the man continued, his voice reverberating with power. You will walk the path that your choices have set before you. You will confront your deepest fears. Only the strongest will survive. Those who falter will remain here, forever trapped. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the meaning of his words settled in. This was no longer a game, it was a life-and-death struggle. But what did he mean by trapped? And how could they possibly survive something like this? Mark. Her mind went back to Mark, but still, there was no sign of him. She could feel the panic rising again, her chest tightening with dread. She had to find him. She couldn't be left alone in this strange, terrifying place. She turned to the others, but they, too, looked just as lost and afraid as she felt. Ben's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. Tom, too, was staring at the figure, frozen, his body stiff as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Jack was still missing, nowhere to be seen. What do we have to do? Ben asked, his voice strained with fear. How do we get out of here? The masked figure turned slowly, his gaze seeming to pierce through them, weighing each of them in turn. There is no escaping the trial, he said coldly. You can only succeed or fail. And when you fail, there will be no coming back. A deep, unnerving silence followed his words, stretching out like an endless void. Sarah wanted to scream, to demand answers, but something in the man's voice made her stop. There was no question of escape. They were here. And they had to play by the rules. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted. Sarah stumbled, her body lurching as the desert floor cracked open, sending a ripple of tremors through the earth. The air grew even hotter, and Sarah felt a strange pressure in her chest, as though the atmosphere itself were pushing down on her. Before she could react, a new sound filled the air, distant, haunting cries. It was a low, mournful wail, like something lost and desperate. The sound seemed to come from the cracks in the ground, echoing all around them. Sarah's heart raced, her instincts telling her to run, but there was nowhere to go. What is that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The souls of the past, the masked figure replied. Those who failed. Who faltered. Now, their cries echo across this land. They are a warning. A reminder. Ben's eyes widened with fear, and he stepped back, bumping into Tom, who had been standing motionless. I don't want to be one of them, Ben muttered, his voice cracking. You won't be, the figure said, his voice softening for the first time, though it still held an air of ominous authority. But only if you face the trial ahead. Only if you prove yourselves worthy of survival. Worthy? Sarah echoed, her voice trembling with disbelief. What does that mean? What do we have to do? The figure stepped closer, his eyes gleaming through the mask. You will each face your own fear. The one that haunts you most. The thing you fear most deeply will manifest in this place. And you will have to confront it. If you can overcome your fear, you will move forward. If not. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The air grew thick with the unspoken threat, and Sarah could almost feel the weight of their failure pressing down on her. The souls, the wailing cries, the oppressive heat, they all seemed to close in on her, filling her mind with dread. But I don't even know what my fear is, she said, her voice rising in panic. How can I fight something I don't even understand? The figure tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. You will understand soon enough, he said. When the trial begins, your fear will show itself. It always does. The ground began to crack again, and Sarah instinctively stepped back, her mind racing with thoughts of what she might face. She didn't know what to expect, didn't know what terror would come to life before her. She had no idea what her trial would be. But she knew one thing. If she didn't face it, she would be trapped here forever. Before Sarah could gather her thoughts, the earth beneath her feet shifted once more, sending her stumbling forward. She had no choice but to keep moving. She felt Mark's absence more keenly than ever now. It was as if a piece of her was missing, and the longer she stood in this vast, empty desert, the more lost she felt. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the voice of the figure again. "Begin the trial," he said, his voice low and foreboding. A thick mist began to rise from the cracked ground, swirling around them. Sarah squinted through the haze, trying to make sense of the shifting shadows, but it was useless. The mist was everywhere, engulfing them in its thick, impenetrable fog. The world seemed to close in on her. The ground trembled again, and Sarah suddenly found herself alone. The others were gone. The masked figure had vanished, and the cries of the lost souls echoed louder in the distance. Panic rose in her chest as she realized she was no longer standing with her friends. "Mark," she whispered, the word falling from her lips like a prayer. But there was no answer. She was completely alone. The desert had become a labyrinth of shifting sands and choking fog, closing in around Sarah until she could barely see a few feet in front of her. The air was thick with the wails of the lost souls, voices that seemed to whisper from the very ground beneath her feet. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled through the mist, disoriented, desperate for some sign of her friends, for Mark. But the more she searched, the further she seemed to move from them. The cries echoed in her mind, filling her with dread and confusion. What had happened to them? Where had they gone? And what was she supposed to do now? The trial, the figure in the mask, his words, they all felt like a distant memory now, fading into the fog. All Sarah could think about was getting out of this place, finding her husband, and escaping whatever twisted game they had been forced into. Her thoughts were scattered, her body aching from the tension that had taken over. Fear gnawed at her insides, but it wasn't just the fear of what might happen. It was something deeper. Something that had been buried inside her for far too long. As she moved through the mist, it felt as if the very fog itself was alive, pulling her deeper into the darkness of her own mind. Then, in the distance, she saw a figure. Her heart skipped a beat as she stopped in her tracks, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. It was him, the figure from before, the masked man who had led them into the desert, who had promised that they would each face their trial. The man who had set the game in motion. But this time, it wasn't just the figure she saw. As the mist parted slightly, she realized there was someone else beside him, someone she knew all too well. Mark. Her heart lurched in her chest, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she might cry out, run toward him, embrace him, and forget everything that had happened. But then, the mist cleared completely, and the sight before her stopped her in her tracks. Mark stood next to the masked man, but he wasn't the man she had known. His face was drawn, his expression cold, as if he were a stranger to her. His eyes, those eyes that had always been full of warmth, full of love, were now empty, as if something inside him had withered and died. "Mark?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "Mark, what's happening? What have they done to you?" Mark's gaze didn't meet hers. Instead, he stood there, motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He didn't speak, didn't move. The figure beside him, still masked, still ominous, turned slowly to face Sarah. "This is your trial," the figure said, his voice low and gravely. "You were chosen. And now, you will face what lies hidden within you." Sarah's pulse quickened, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she took a step forward. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she couldn't stop. She needed answers. She needed to understand. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What is happening to Mark? Why is he like this?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as if he were studying her. "This is your fear, Sarah. Your trial is one of the mind, one of your deepest emotions. You see, the greatest fear is not of the unknown, it is of what we know, what we have hidden from ourselves. What we fail to acknowledge, to confront." Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. What did that mean? What was he trying to say? And what had they done to Mark? The figure gestured to Mark. "Your trial is to face the truth. To face what lies buried in your past. You can try to deny it, to avoid it, but it will find you, always." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Was this really happening? This couldn't be real. This couldn't be what she was facing. She had to wake up, had to escape, but something deep inside her, something she couldn't quite name, told her that this was no dream. This was her reality now. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, the fear thick in her throat. "What truth?" The figure stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "The truth that lies within you. The truth about Mark. About the choices you made, about the things you've hidden from each other. This is the moment you face your own demons." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. A wave of realization washed over her. This wasn't just about survival, not anymore. This was about something deeper. Something far more personal. "I don't understand," she said again, her voice rising in panic. Mark is my husband. I love him. I've always loved him." The masked figure slowly shook his head. "Your love is not enough to save you. You have been running from the truth for too long, Sarah. You need to face it now. Only then can you move forward." Mark's eyes flickered for a moment, and Sarah took a step closer, reaching for him. "Mark," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached out. "Please, look at me. Please, come back to me." But Mark didn't move. His eyes remained empty, lifeless. His silence was worse than 1,000 words. It was as if she had lost him, not to the game, but to something far worse. "This is it, Sarah," the figure continued, his voice calm, but with an edge of finality. "This is your trial. Confront the truth. Confront what you've been running from. And then, you will be free." The desert around them seemed to shift, the sand swirling in the wind, the distant cries of the souls growing louder. Sarah felt herself being pulled into the center of the storm, as if the very air were closing in on her. The truth. What was the truth? What had she been running from? Then it hit her. The truth she had buried, the truth about herself, about her fears, her insecurities. It wasn't about Mark. It wasn't about the game. It was about the way she had lived her life, the way she had hidden her own doubts. The fears she had pushed away, the fears of not being enough, the fear that maybe, just maybe, she had never really understood herself or the person she had married. Mark wasn't the one she had been afraid of. It was herself. She had been terrified of facing her own insecurities, of confronting the cracks in her marriage, the things they had never said to each other. She had spent years pushing those feelings aside, hiding from the truth. And now, in this moment, she had no choice but to confront it. With a shaky breath, Sarah turned to face Mark, her heart aching. She stepped closer to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, I've been scared. I've been so scared of losing you, of losing us. But I can't keep running. I can't keep pretending everything is perfect when it isn't. I love you, but I've been afraid to show you everything. Afraid to be vulnerable with you. I've kept parts of myself hidden, because I was afraid of what would happen if you saw the real me." Her voice trembled with the weight of her words, and for a moment, there was silence. The figure, still standing silently beside them, seemed to watch with detached interest, as if this was exactly what he had expected. And then, something happened. Mark's eyes, once so hollow, flickered with life. A faint light seemed to return to them, and he took a step forward. It was as though he had heard her, as if her confession had reached him through the fog, through the emptiness that had consumed him. "Sarah," Mark said softly, his voice strained. "I've been afraid too. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of everything we've built falling apart. But I'm here. I'm not leaving you." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she reached out to him. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I didn't realize how much I was holding back." "I know," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "But we're here now. Together." The fog began to lift, the harsh desert landscape softening as the trial's grip loosened. The figure in the mask stepped back, fading into the mist, his presence no longer looming over them. The cries of the lost souls seemed to fade as well, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. "You have passed," the masked figure's voice echoed distantly, as if coming from far away. "You have faced your truths. And now, you are free." As the mist cleared completely, Sarah and Mark found themselves standing in the middle of a lush, sunlit field, the warmth of the sun against their skin. The air was fresh, the cries gone, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves. The heavy weight of fear was gone. They were free. But the world around them was different, calmer, brighter. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. The trial was over. The journey was complete.